In 1945, Europe was in chaos. The Second World War was coming to an end, and Nazi Germany was collapsing under the pressure of Allied forces. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was advancing rapidly, driving back German forces that had once invaded their homeland. For many in the Soviet Union, this victory over Nazi Germany was personal. Millions of Soviet citizens had died, and entire cities had been destroyed by the Nazis during their brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, as Soviet troops pushed into Germany, many soldiers saw this as their chance to seek revenge. But as the war came to a close, the situation for German civilians became terrifying. With their country in ruins and their leaders defeated, ordinary people found themselves in the middle of a nightmare. One of the darkest aspects of this was the violence that German women faced from Soviet soldiers. The role of propaganda and revenge. The violence against German women didn't happen in isolation. It was fueled by years of war, suffering, and hatred. Soviet soldiers had seen unimaginable horrors during the Nazi invasion of their country, and now that they were in Germany, many were filled with anger and a desire for revenge. Soviet propaganda also played a role. Throughout the war, Nazi Germany was portrayed as the ultimate enemy, and this included the German people as a whole. Many Soviet soldiers saw all Germans, including women, as responsible for the suffering that their own families had endured. The soldiers weren't just taking over territory. For some, this was a chance to humiliate the people who had invaded their homeland. Sadly, many of them took out their anger on the most vulnerable, German women. The chaos of the Soviet invasion. When the Red Army entered German cities, the situation was chaotic. The Soviet forces had been fighting a brutal war for years, and by the time they reached Germany, there was little control over the soldiers. Commanders often failed to keep order, and the lines between soldier and criminal blurred. Many Soviet soldiers were exhausted, traumatized, and in some cases, out of control. As they moved through German towns and villages, widespread looting, destruction, and violence followed. With no real system of law in place, some soldiers felt free to act without consequences. German civilians, especially women, became easy targets. The violence that German women faced at the hands of Soviet soldiers was on an unimaginable scale. Historians estimate that as many as 2 million women were raped during the Soviet occupation. These attacks were not isolated incidents, but a widespread and horrific pattern of violence. Women were attacked in their homes, on the streets, and even in public shelters where they sought refuge from the fighting. Many survivors described being assaulted multiple times by different soldiers. The violence wasn't limited to one age group either. Girls as young as 12 and women in their 70s were all victims of these brutal attacks. The scale of the assaults was so vast that in some areas, it affected nearly every woman. This period remains one of the most tragic and often overlooked aspects of the end of World War II. The brutality of the assaults is hard to imagine. Women weren't just raped, they were often beaten, humiliated, and even killed. Many Soviet soldiers were drunk, and their rage made the attacks even more violent. In some cases, groups of soldiers would attack women together, leaving them severely injured or traumatized for life. These assaults took place in front of families, friends, and neighbors, adding another layer of terror and humiliation. What made the situation even worse was that there was often no one to turn to for help. German society was in ruins, and there were no laws or systems in place to protect the women from these crimes. Many women were forced to endure this violence in silence, knowing that speaking out wouldn't change anything. As Soviet forces advanced westward in early 1945, reports of violence against civilians, particularly women, began to surface in areas like East Prussia and Silesia. These regions, some of the first to fall under Soviet control, became sites of widespread assault. The Red Army, filled with frustration and rage from years of brutal warfare and atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, unleashed violence upon the local population. Civilians in these areas were largely unprotected, and women faced a significant risk of sexual assault. Initial reports from cities like Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, described instances of sexual violence committed by Soviet soldiers. The chaos of war and the breakdown of social structures allowed such crimes to happen with little immediate consequence. Some German civilians, already devastated by the war, had little recourse in reporting these crimes, as authorities were often overwhelmed or unwilling to act. These early incidents of violence set a precedent for what would occur on a larger scale as Soviet forces continued to move deeper into Germany. Sexual violence during the Soviet invasion of Germany was not random. It became a tool of humiliation and domination in the context of a brutal war. The Soviet soldiers, after enduring immense suffering and losses due to Nazi atrocities, often sought revenge in the form of violence against German civilians, especially women. Unfortunately, this took the form of widespread sexual assaults, which affected countless women during the final stages of the war. Historians have noted that rape was used as a form of psychological warfare, meant to demoralize and humiliate the German people. The violence wasn't just about physical assault, it was a means of asserting dominance over the defeated nation. Soviet propaganda had portrayed Germans as the enemy responsible for massive atrocities on Soviet soil, and this portrayal contributed to a mindset of collective guilt. The lines between combatants and civilians were blurred, making women particularly vulnerable to these acts. The impact of the violence on German women and their families was devastating. Survivors of sexual assault faced physical and emotional trauma, as well as the stigma that came with being a victim of rape. In post-war German society, women who had been assaulted often remained silent due to the shame associated with their experiences. Many feared judgment from their families and communities, adding another layer of suffering. Some women became pregnant as a result of the assaults, which further complicated their lives. In a deeply conservative society, the presence of children born from these assaults often led to rejection or isolation. The psychological toll on women, their families, and even their communities was profound, as they struggled to cope with the long-term effects of the violence. Many survivors suffered in silence for decades, and the trauma often extended beyond the immediate victims to their children and future generations. After the war, the issue of sexual violence committed by Soviet soldiers was largely silenced. German society, already grappling with the horrors of the Nazi regime, was not equipped to address the suffering of women who had been assaulted. Additionally, the Cold War's political climate made it difficult to openly criticize Soviet actions, as the Soviet Union quickly became a major global power and an ally to some nations in the rebuilding process. Survivors of rape during the Soviet occupation often felt unable to speak out due to the stigma attached to sexual violence. In the conservative post-war environment, victims were sometimes blamed for what had happened to them, and the trauma they endured was compounded by social judgment. It wasn't until much later, in the 1990s, that historians and survivors began to speak more openly about the mass. This long period of silence made it difficult for the survivors to heal, as their experiences were often ignored or dismissed. The attitudes of Soviet soldiers during the final months of World War II were complex and shaped by years of brutal fighting. Many soldiers had experienced unimaginable losses at the hands of the Nazis, and the Soviet Union had suffered some of the highest civilian and military casualties during the war. These soldiers were often motivated by a desire for revenge against the Germans, who had been responsible for atrocities on Soviet soil. Propaganda during the war painted Germans as a collective enemy, which blurred the lines between combatants and civilians in the minds of many soldiers. While some soldiers justified their actions as revenge, others were simply taking advantage of the chaos and breakdown of law and order in the war's final stages. The lack of discipline and oversight within the Red Army contributed to the widespread violence, and commanders often turned a blind eye to the actions of their troops. The violence that occurred during the Soviet invasion of Germany, particularly the widespread sexual assaults, raised questions about the role of Soviet leadership in preventing or controlling such acts. While it is clear that individual soldiers committed many of these crimes, there was a noticeable lack of effective intervention from Soviet commanders. The chaos of war, combined with an overwhelmed and exhausted leadership, allowed these atrocities to continue unchecked. Some historians argue that Soviet commanders, who had seen the destruction wrought by the Germans on Soviet soil, were either unwilling or unable to enforce strict discipline among their troops. In some cases, officers turned a blind eye to the actions of their men, seeing it as part of the soldiers' right to revenge. Others, including Marshal Zhukov, made efforts to curtail the violence, but these attempts were often inconsistent and poorly enforced. The leadership's inconsistent response, along with the sheer size of the advancing Soviet army, made it extremely difficult to control the behavior of individual soldiers, leading to tragic consequences for German civilians. The psychological toll on the Soviet soldiers themselves is another important aspect of this history. Many of the Red Army soldiers had experienced the horrors of Nazi occupation firsthand, witnessing atrocities against Soviet civilians and soldiers alike. This trauma, combined with the intense propaganda that painted all Germans as responsible for these horrors, contributed to a mindset that allowed for acts of revenge. However, the violence also had a lasting impact on the soldiers who perpetrated these crimes. While some soldiers acted out of rage or under peer pressure, many would later carry the weight of their actions with them. Accounts from Soviet veterans suggest that not all soldiers participated willingly, and some were deeply troubled by what they witnessed or were coerced into doing. The psychological damage inflicted by years of brutal warfare left many soldiers struggling to reconcile their actions with their sense of humanity. In the post-war years, the memories of these events haunted some veterans, who found it difficult to reintegrate into society after the war ended. The international community largely remains silent about the atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers during the final stages of World War II. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the focus was on rebuilding war-torn Europe and bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. The Cold War, which began shortly after the conclusion of World War II, further complicated the ability of the West to criticize Soviet actions. The Soviet Union had emerged as a major global power, and its role in defeating Nazi Germany made it an essential player in the post-war order. As a result, the mass and other war crimes committed by Soviet soldiers were not widely addressed in the immediate post-war years. The political climate of the time, including the growing rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, made it difficult to openly discuss these issues. Even within Germany, there was little public discourse about the violence, as the country struggled with its own guilt and responsibility for the atrocities of the Nazi regime. It wasn't until decades later that these events became a subject of historical inquiry and public acknowledgment. For the women who survived the violence, the road to healing was long and difficult. Many women who were assaulted during the Soviet invasion were left with deep emotional scars, in addition to physical trauma. The societal stigma surrounding sexual violence meant that many survivors were reluctant to speak about their experiences, and those who did often faced judgment from their communities. In post-war Germany, the focus was on rebuilding the country and coming to terms with the legacy of the Nazi era, leaving little space for the acknowledgement of the suffering of these women. Some survivors found solace in sharing their stories with each other, creating small support networks. However, it wasn't until decades later that the broader society began to acknowledge their pain. As historians and journalists began to investigate the mass of 1945, some survivors felt empowered to come forward and share their experiences. The publication of personal accounts and the work of historians have helped to shed light on this dark chapter of history. But for many women, the trauma they experienced remained with them for the rest of their lives. The mass assaults committed by Soviet soldiers during the final months of World War II had lasting consequences for both the survivors and the broader German society. While the violence eventually subsided as the Soviet occupation became more formalized and structured, the damage had already been done. The psychological and emotional trauma endured by the survivors continued to affect their lives for decades after the war, impacting families and future generations. The broader consequences of these atrocities also played a role in shaping post-war relations between the Soviet Union and Germany. Although the Soviet Union would eventually become a major force in the division of Germany and the Cold War, the violence of 1945 left a lasting scar on the German population. In East Germany, where the Soviet Union maintained control for decades, the memory of these events was often suppressed, as the government sought to present a united front with its Soviet allies. However, in the long term, these events contributed to the complex and often tense relationship between the two nations,